They sang about heaven, but faced hell on earth. From scandals to stage fights, these gospel legends were loved, hated, and unforgettable. Welcome to the 18 most hated gospel legends. 1.
Right now, my world needs you right now.
Kirk Franklin stands as one of gospel music's most electrifying yet polarizing figures. To some, he's a visionary who revolutionized an aging genre, dragging church music into the streets where the rhythms of hip-hop, R&B, and urban soul could meet divine lyrics. To others, he's the very embodiment of what went wrong with modern gospel, a man who blurred sacred lines so deeply that the spirit feels lost in the groove. Born in Fort Worth, Texas, and raised amid hardship, Franklin was a prodigy of the church choir, a kid who could command voices and keys before most kids could spell harmony. But when his album started topping charts that gospel artists had never touched before, rubbing shoulders with R&B and pop icons, it was clear he wasn't here to preserve tradition. He was here to transform it. That transformation didn't sit well with everyone. Gospel purists saw Franklin's beats, collaborations with secular artists, and hip-hop-infused hooks as a betrayal of holiness. Songs like Stomp, featuring Saul from Salt and Pepper, scandalized conservative churchgoers who accused him of turning praise into party music. Yet for millions of young believers, Franklin's sound was liberation. It said faith could dance, shout, and still be real. His fusion of gritty street language and gospel conviction created a bridge for those who felt alienated by old-school sanctuaries. But with every crossover hit came another sermon, another pastor condemning him for watering down the message. And the louder the critics became, the more unapologetically Franklin pushed forward, dressing like a rapper, talking like a preacher, and performing like both, beyond music. Franklin's life has been an open book of contradictions and redemption arcs. He's publicly confessed his past addiction to pornography, feuded with record labels and family, and spoken openly about church hurt. His sometimes volatile relationship with his son exploded online, and that vulnerability, airing private wounds in public, only deepened the divide among fans. Some admired his honesty, seeing a man who never hid behind religion's polished mask. Others saw arrogance, a craving for attention disguised as transparency. For all his flaws, though, there's an unshakable humanity in him. He never claims to be perfect. He just insists God can use imperfection to reach the unreachable. 2.
He who was and is and is to come. Hallelujah.
Donnie McClurkin's voice is one of the most recognizable in gospel music. Rich, soaring, and drenched in the kind of emotion that makes even the hardest heart tremble. His songs like Stand and We Fall Down have become anthems of resilience and grace, echoing through churches and arenas around the world. Yet behind that divine sound lies a man whose name sparks just as much debate as devotion. McClurkin's story is one of pain and faith, of personal battles made public and beliefs that have divided audiences. For years, he's been celebrated as a living testimony, a man who overcame trauma, abuse, and inner conflict to become one of gospel's most decorated artists. But it's also that very testimony and the convictions born from it that have made him one of the most polarizing figures in the gospel world. His controversy stems from his outspoken views on sexuality, particularly his comments about homosexuality and conversion. McClurkin has spoken openly about being molested as a child and how those experiences shaped his struggles with same-sex attraction, often framing his journey as one of deliverance and spiritual healing. To his supporters, this honesty is brave, a declaration of victory over a painful past. But to many others, especially within the LGBTQ+ community, his stance feels deeply harmful. His repeated claims that God delivered him have been seen as a form of spiritual rejection, a reinforcement of conversion therapy narratives that countless people have called abusive and damaging. Protests have followed him to events. Invitations have been withdrawn, and his name often stirs online firestorms about whether faith and compassion can coexist with such exclusionary beliefs. Through it all, McClurkin's demeanor has remained one of quiet conviction. He rarely backs down from what he believes is truth, even when it costs him acceptance in mainstream circles. He sees himself not as hateful, but as a messenger of deliverance, someone who found a way out of brokenness and wants to offer others the same hope. And yet, that hope feels different depending on where you stand. To some, he's a man of courage and unwavering faith. To others, a symbol of the church's ongoing struggle with love and judgment. That tension has defined his public life. Every concert feels like both a worship service and a statement. Every interview another trial before the court of public opinion. 3. Marvin Sapp's story is one of triumph and turbulence, a blend of soaring faith and very human struggle. For many listeners, Never Would Have Made It wasn't just a gospel hit. It was a lifeline. That song, born out of grief after his wife's death, became a soundtrack for anyone who'd ever survived loss or heartbreak. Its raw honesty catapulted Sapp into gospel superstardom, crossing boundaries of faith and genre. But with fame came friction. As his influence grew, so did the scrutiny, and before long, Sapp's name was no longer just synonymous with worship. It became entangled in whispers of lawsuits, money disputes, and fractured relationships behind the scenes. The controversies that followed his success didn't revolve around moral scandal or personal sin, but something less visible and just as corrosive: business. Former label partners and associates accused him of breach of contract and financial impropriety. Claims that spilled into courtrooms and the public eye. What had once been a picture of ministry-driven collaboration began to look to outsiders like another case of gospel's uneasy marriage between calling and commerce. Sapp, for his part, defended his integrity, often reminding critics that success comes with enemies and that not every partnership is built to last. But in a community that holds spiritual leaders to near impossible standards, even a hint of financial dispute can stain a legacy built on faith and humility. For those who followed his journey closely, the tension lies in the contrast between his message and the messiness of his public battles. Never Would Have Made It speaks of gratitude and divine help, yet his later headlines painted pictures of contracts, countersuits, and broken trust. It's a reminder that gospel artists, however anointed, operate in the same flawed industry machinery that governs pop and hip-hop stars. To some fans, these disputes were just part of the price of prominence. To others, they revealed a troubling pattern in how gospel's biggest figures balance ministry with money. The quiet irony of seeing one of gospel's most heartfelt ministers caught up in corporate chaos was not lost on anyone. For Yolanda Adams has long been celebrated as gospel's golden voice, a towering figure whose elegance, control, and range can make scripture sound like silk. Her music, filled with warmth and hope, has crossed generations and genres, earning her a reputation as both a spiritual vessel and a crossover pioneer. But as with many who blur the line between sacred and secular, Adams' journey hasn't been free from criticism. For years, gospel traditionalists have wrestled with her polished, contemporary sound, smooth jazz chords, R&B melodies, even pop-inflected production that sometimes feels more Sunday brunch than Sunday service. To her supporters, she represents progress, a woman who brought gospel into boardrooms, television, and luxury stages without ever denying her faith. But to others, her success is tinged with compromise, a gentle slide from the pulpit to the mainstream. The tension surrounding Yolanda Adams has always been subtle, not built on scandal but on perception. Her music, especially in albums like Believe and Asterisk Mountain High, Valley Low Asterisk, was deeply inspirational but deliberately refined, tailored for radio audiences far beyond the pews. Critics within the church sometimes accused her of making gospel too clean, too commercial, of stripping the grit and rawness that once defined the genre's spiritual power. Yet that very smoothness opened doors gospel had long been locked out of. She performed at the White House, shared stages with Whitney Houston, and inspired countless singers to see that ministry could also be sophisticated. Adams herself often defended her style as simply a new way to glorify God, arguing that the message, not the method, was what mattered most. Then came the scrutiny of her personal life, specifically her divorce. In a world where gospel artists are expected to mirror divine perfection, Adams' separation became fodder for whispers and speculation. For some fans, it felt like a contradiction. The woman who sang about faith and endurance now facing public heartbreak. But in many ways, her honesty about pain only deepened her humanity. She didn't hide behind her image. She simply kept singing, her songs taking on new layers of meaning as listeners realized that even those who lead in faith can break and heal. Divorce didn't destroy her testimony. It refined it, grounding her polished persona in real, imperfect life. 5. Mary Mary, Erica, and Tina Campbell burst onto the gospel scene like a sonic revolution. Their debut single, Shackles, Praise You, didn't just chart, it shattered barriers. Suddenly, gospel had swagger, bass, and bounce. Suddenly, faith was something you could dance to in your car or hear in a club. The sisters' fusion of hip-hop beats, R&B harmonies, and unapologetically modern lyrics rewrote what gospel could sound like to a generation raised on Destiny's Child and Lauryn Hill. Mary Mary felt like the bridge between worship and the real world. But that same boldness that made them famous also made them lightning rods for controversy. To traditionalists, they weren't saving gospel. They were desecrating it with vanity, flash, and fame. The criticisms came fast and often, and not always from outside the church. Their wardrobe choices, tight jeans, high heels, red carpets, were attacked as too sexy for sanctuary. Their lyrics were picked apart, especially on songs like God in Me, which celebrated blessings, success, and confidence in ways that some felt bordered on materialism. Many pastors and gospel critics accused them of preaching prosperity over piety. Yet for their fans, that was the point. Mary Mary gave women permission to love God and themselves, to walk in blessings without apology, to see divine favor not as vanity but as victory. They became symbols of modern faith, flawed, fashionable, and fiercely authentic. But authenticity, when lived out loud, has a way of offending those who prefer their saints spotless. Then came their reality show, Mary Mary, which peeled back the glossy album covers and exposed the raw, messy truth behind the harmonies. Viewers saw marital infidelity, sibling fights, tears, and prayers colliding in the same frame. For some, this vulnerability made them even more relatable. Real women who cried, cussed, and still sang their hearts out on Sunday morning. But for others, it was too much. The church wasn't ready to see its darlings bleeding on camera. Critics accused them of turning ministry into spectacle, of airing sacred struggles for ratings. Yet even amid the backlash, their honesty resonated with those who've been taught to hide their pain. Mary Mary's willingness to show imperfection in public was both scandalous and healing, depending on who you asked. 6.
My uncle, which is a presbyter of Southern California, asked him, he said, Ben Crouch.
Andraé Crouch was a man ahead of his time. So far ahead, in fact, that much of the church wasn't ready for him. In the 1970s and 80s, when gospel music was still tightly bound to organs, choirs, and a familiar swing of traditional hymnody, Crouch came blazing through with guitars, brass, and rhythm sections that felt more home in a rock concert than a revival tent. His songs, Soon and Very Soon, The Blood Will Never Lose Its Power, through it all, carried the unmistakable stamp of pop craftsmanship. He fused faith with funk, scripture with soul. But while audiences around the world embraced his sound, church elders called it rebellion. They accused him of bringing the world into the church, of seducing worshipers with rhythm instead of reverence. For many, Andraé Crouch was both a miracle and a menace. He never set out to cause division. He just believed that the message of Christ could travel further if it spoke the language of the streets. But in that era, gospel was sacred territory, and innovation looked like infiltration. Crouch's concerts drew young believers who wore afros and denim instead of suits and dresses, hands lifted high in worship that moved like a wave instead of choir march. For conservative churchgoers, this was chaos disguised as praise. Yet Crouch's melodies had power. They crossed racial and cultural lines, inspiring collaborations with artists like Michael Jackson, Elton John, and Madonna. Every hit he wrote seemed to pull gospel closer to the mainstream, and every one of those hits deepened the church's suspicion that fame had replaced faith. The irony, of course, was that his message never changed. Only the sound did. Behind the controversy was a man of humility and unshakable conviction. Crouch often said he wrote songs to make people feel God's presence, not his own genius. But genius has a way of unsettling comfort zones. He built bridges between sacred and secular worlds, and in doing so, revealed how fragile those boundaries really were. Pastors condemned his drums and electric guitars. Yet those same instruments soon became staples of Sunday services across the nation. His style, once called dangerous, eventually became the blueprint for contemporary gospel itself. The very music that church leaders once rejected is now the heartbeat of worship bands worldwide. History didn't just vindicate Andraé Crouch, it crowned him. 7.
Your head is too hard, your skull is too thick. But look at your neighbor and tell him the devil is...
Shirley Caesar is gospel royalty. Her name alone commands reverence. Her voice a storm of conviction that has echoed through sanctuaries for more than half a century. To generations of believers, she's a gold standard. The voice that could summon the spirit, the storyteller who turned sermons into song, and the performer whose every note felt like church itself. But behind that iconic stature lies a woman unafraid to speak her mind, and that boldness has kept her at the center of controversy, especially in an era where gospel has grown more commercial, more blended with pop and R&B than ever before. Known as the First Lady of Gospel, Shirley Caesar has become both a guardian of tradition and, to some, a gatekeeper who refuses to let the music move forward. Her critiques of modern gospel artists are legendary and divisive. Over the years, Caesar has publicly voiced concern that the younger generation is losing its spiritual core, trading anointing for applause and turning gospel into entertainment. She's spoken bluntly about performances she feels are too worldly, about wardrobe she deems inappropriate for the pulpit, and about songs that mention God but lack the deep reverence of the old hymns. For some, her candor is refreshing, a necessary voice of accountability in a time when gospel often sounds indistinguishable from mainstream R&B. But for others, her comments come across as judgmental and outdated, a refusal to accept that the gospel message can evolve with the times. Younger artists who grew up idolizing her sometimes find themselves on the receiving end of her disappointment, creating an uncomfortable tension between respect and rebellion. Yet even her critics can't deny the sincerity that fuels her words. Caesar isn't bitter, she's burdened. Having come up in an era where gospel singers weren't chasing Grammys or brand endorsements, she carries a sacred nostalgia for when the music was ministry first, career second. Her outspokenness reflects a deep love for the church and a fear that its fire is being replaced by performance lights. Still, her willingness to say aloud what many elders whisper in private has made her a lightning rod. Every new interview or comment she gives seems to reignite the debate over what gospel should sound like, holy or hip, sanctified or stylistic. 8. The Clark sisters are the blueprint for modern gospel harmony, daring, dazzling, and unapologetically different. When they emerged under the watchful eye of their mother and mentor, the formidable Dr. Mattie Moss Clark, they carried both divine talent and defiant innovation. Their sound was electric, jazzy chords, sharp modulations, and vocal runs so intricate they felt more like jazz improvisations than church refrains. Songs like You Brought the Sunshine and Is My Living in Vain pushed gospel into uncharted sonic territory. But while audiences eventually hailed them as legends, the early years were rough. Many in the church world dismissed them as too flashy, too experimental, too worldly. They were told their bop had no business in sacred music. What they were really doing, though, was reshaping gospel's DNA, fusing sanctified lyrics with the grooves of Motown and the freedom of jazz. The backlash was fierce at first. Pastors and choir directors accused the sisters of tainting the holy sound with secular rhythms. Their bold stage presence, stylish wardrobes, and even their youthful energy were treated as distractions from the message. But the Clark sisters refused to shrink. Under Mattie Moss Clark's discipline, they learned to wield both their innovation and their faith with precision. The same musicality that made them controversial eventually became gospel's gold standard. By the time the world caught up, it was clear they hadn't betrayed gospel. They had expanded it. Still, being pioneers came with emotional costs. Their rise was steeped in family tension, public pressure, and the weight of living up to a mother whose expectations were as exacting as her genius. The relationship between the sisters and Dr. Mattie Moss Clark remains one of gospel's most complex family sagas. She was their teacher, manager, and spiritual compass, but also a relentless perfectionist whose drive often clashed with a desire for independence. behind her radiant harmonies were years of struggle over control, money, and personal freedom. The sisters, each a powerhouse in her own right. Jackie's clarity, Dorinda's fire, Karen's range, Twinkie's genius. Sometimes found themselves divided between loyalty and liberation. Those tensions spilled into the public eye, painting a portrait of brilliance entangled with burden. Their family's story became a mirror of the black church experience itself. Love, pain, sacrifice, and an unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of faith. 9.
Now I thank you for all that you've done.
The journey of BeBe and CeCe Winans to becoming one of the most celebrated duos in gospel music was not without its early controversies, which created a notable divide among audiences. Their initial emergence onto the national stage was intricately tied to Jim and Tammy Faye Backer's televised ministry, the PTL Club, where they first gained widespread attention as featured vocalists. This association, however, became a significant source of polarization when the PTL organization was later engulfed in a devastating financial and sex scandal. The subsequent fallout placed the young siblings in a difficult position, forcing them to defend their own integrity and musical mission amidst the chaos of a very public ministry's disgrace, a situation that inevitably colored some listeners' perception of their early work. Beyond the complicated shadow of their PTL launch, the very sound that defined BeBe and CeCe's music became a profound point of contention within the gospel community itself. During the 1980s and 90s, the genre was largely dominated by traditional choirs, straightforward hymns, and a distinct sonic separation from secular pop. BeBe and CeCe, however, boldly defied these conventions by crafting a polished, sophisticated sound that seamlessly wove together contemporary R&B rhythms, smooth pop melodies, and impeccable production. Their groundbreaking hits, including Heaven and Addictive Love, were unapologetically modern, earning them heavy rotation on mainstream radio and attracting a vast audience that extended far beyond the church walls. This successful crossover, however, was met with skepticism and criticism from gospel traditionalists. For some purists, their polished, pop-oriented approach was seen as a dilution of the gospel message, a compromise with secular culture for the sake of commercial success. The debate centered on whether their music was primarily a tool for ministry or a product designed for entertainment, with critics arguing that the spiritual core of gospel was being lost in pursuit of chart performance and broad appeal. This tension highlighted a deeper, ongoing conversation within the African American church about the boundaries of sacred music and the perils of cultural assimilation. 10.
Within our midst, is it?
Following her groundbreaking work with her brother BeBe, CeCe Winans embarked on a solo career that solidified her status as a gospel icon, yet this phase of her journey was also marked by its own distinct points of contention. Having already helped redefine contemporary gospel with the duo's pop-infused sound, CeCe as a solo artist began to navigate an even more nuanced musical path. Her incredible success, including albums celebrated across the board, seemed to place her at the very heart of the modern gospel scene. But this very position made her subsequent artistic choices subject of intense scrutiny and debate among her core audience. The polarization surrounding her solo work crystallized around a perceptible shift in her musical direction, particularly with albums like Throne Room. While undeniably worshipful and spiritually grounded, the sound on this and subsequent projects was often characterized as leaning more broadly into mainstream inspirational and contemporary Christian music genres rather than the distinctively gospel traditions that many of her longtime listeners cherished. This was not a move into secular music, but rather a refinement of her sound that some perceived as a softening of the bold, black, church-rooted gospel identity that had been a hallmark of her earlier career, both with BeBe and on her initial solo releases. For a segment of her core gospel following, this evolution felt like a departure, an abandonment of the genre that had launched her in favor of a more homogenized, crossover-friendly approach. Critics and traditionalists voiced concerns that in seeking to create music for a universal, multi-ethnic audience, the specific cultural and musical textures of traditional gospel were being diminished. This sparked debates within the community about the boundaries of the genre and the expectations placed upon its biggest stars, with some fans expressing a sense that CeCe was moving away from them musically, even as her message remained one of faith. 11.
Oh, a change change had to come.
Kim Burrell's career stands as a complex testament to the power and peril of the public voice, a journey where phenomenal artistic gift has been shadowed by profound controversy. Widely revered within gospel music and the broader music industry as a vocalist, her unparalleled technical skill and innovative phrasing earned her the respect of legends and peers alike. Her influence extended beyond the church, leading collaborations with prominent artists like Harry Connick Jr. and Frank Ocean, who admired her unique musicality. This cross-genre appreciation positioned her as a modern ambassador for gospel sonic possibilities, an artist whose talent seemed to transcend musical boundaries and promised a lasting, impactful legacy. This promise was severely compromised, however, by a single event that would come to define her public persona for a vast audience. In late 2016, a video of a sermon Burrell delivered went viral, in which she used harsh and inflammatory language specifically directed at the LGBTQ+ community. The backlash was swift and severe. The incident occurred as she was promoting her collaboration on the soundtrack for the film The Star, and she was promptly dropped from a scheduled appearance on the Ellen DeGeneres Show. The media scrutiny and public condemnation created a firestorm, framing Burrell not as a gifted musician, but as a figure of intolerance, dramatically altering the trajectory of her career. The polarization she embodies lies in the stark dichotomy between the artist and the preacher, and how different audiences reconcile the two. For many, particularly in more conservative religious circles, her comments, however strongly worded, were seen as a reflection of traditional biblical interpretation. They defended her right to express her religious beliefs, viewing the backlash as an infringement on free speech and a misunderstanding of her pastoral context. For her critics and the wider public, however, her words were perceived as harmful and hateful, incompatible with the inclusive and loving message many believe is at the core of gospel music. This created an irreconcilable conflict for many fans and collaborators who found it difficult to separate the sublime beauty of her art from the perceived vitriol of her statements. 12. The career of the artist, known initially as Tone and later as BeBe, Slade represents one of the most profound and complex stories of polarization within modern gospel music, a journey marked by both breathtaking artistic innovation and intense cultural backlash. From his very debut, Tone was a revolutionary force, an incredibly gifted singer, producer, and songwriter whose musical palette was wildly eclectic. He fearlessly fused traditional gospel with funk, hip-hop, jazz, and soul, creating a vibrant, avant-garde sound that defied all conventions. This nouveau style, as he termed it, was celebrated by many for its creativity and energy, but also drew sharp criticism from gospel traditionalists who viewed his unpredictable and often eccentric performances as inappropriate for the sanctity of the genre, setting the stage for a career that would constantly challenge the boundaries of the industry. The existing controversy surrounding his artistic style was dramatically eclipsed, however, when Tone became the subject of widespread rumors regarding his sexuality. The situation exploded into a public firestorm when he explicitly addressed these rumors, first confirming he was gay and later identifying as bisexual, in an industry and a faith community where such identities were, and for many, remain deeply taboo. This admission was seismic. The consequences were swift and severe. Many gospel radio stations immediately pulled his music from their rotations, and Christian bookstores removed his albums from their shelves. He was effectively ostracized by a significant portion of the gospel establishment, which saw his identity as being in direct conflict with the teachings of the church. This rejection created a stark polarization that framed the central conflict of his public narrative. For conservative religious audiences and gatekeepers, his sexuality was an unforgivable sin that invalidated his ministry and rendered his music unsuitable for a gospel audience. They saw his removal from platforms as a necessary upholding of biblical principles. For his supporters and for many LGBTQ+ individuals of faith, however, Tone became a symbol of courage and a poignant example of the painful clash between personal identity and spiritual community. His exile highlighted profound lack of space for queer artists within the mainstream gospel industry, sparking difficult but necessary conversations about faith, love, and acceptance. 13. For decades, Dottie Peoples has been celebrated as a Queen of Gospel Music, a title earned through a powerful voice and a catalog of beloved anthems like Testimony and He's an On-Time God that have become staples in churches and homes. Her music, rooted in the traditional sounds of the Black church, established a deep bond of trust and reverence with her audience, who saw in her not just a performer, but a pillar of spiritual integrity. This made the very public and bitter controversy that later engulfed her career all the more startling and divisive for the gospel community, challenging perception of the industry and the artists alike. The polarization stemmed from a protracted and acrimonious legal battle with her longtime record label, Atlantic International Records, Air, and its founder, Andrew L. Bullock III. The dispute centered on allegations of unpaid royalties and, most significantly, the contentious ownership of her master recordings. For an artist whose work is so deeply personal and spiritually significant, the masters represented more than just financial assets. They were the sacred artifact of her life's ministry. The lawsuit pulled back the curtain on the often opaque business dealings within gospel music, revealing a painful rift between the creator of the music and the corporation that distributed it. This legal war created a clear schism among her followers and within the industry. Many fans and fellow artists rallied behind Peoples, viewing her fight as a righteous stand for artistic ownership and economic justice, a necessary challenge to a system that has historically exploited gospel artists. They saw her courage in taking on a powerful label as an extension of the very messages of empowerment and faith she sang about. For others, however, the very public airing of grievances and the bitterness of the legal dispute were uncomfortable, seeming at odds with the message of forgiveness and spiritual focus they expected from a gospel luminary. It sparked debates about whether such secular battles undermine the spiritual witness of the music. 14. Bishop Hezekiah Walker stands as a formidable and influential figure in the landscape of contemporary gospel music, renowned both as a founder of the Love Fellowship Crusade Choir and as a successful pastor of megachurch. His musical contributions, including anthems like Better and Every Praise, have become ubiquitous in churches and homes, cementing his status as a powerhouse who helped define the modern gospel choir sound. Yet, his widespread influence is accompanied by a significant degree of polarization, a divide rooted not in musical style, but in the theological framework that underpins both his ministry and his message. This framework has positioned him as a central and often controversial figure in a long-standing debate within the Christian community. The core of the controversy surrounding Bishop Walker is his prominent association with the prosperity gospel or word of faith movement. This theological perspective, which emphasizes faith as a conduit for material and physical blessings, including health and wealth, has been a cornerstone of his preaching and is often reflected in the themes of his music and his public persona. For his congregation and a global audience of followers, this message is received as a powerful source of hope and empowerment. It is interpreted as a divine promise that God desires to bless the faithful in tangible ways, offering a religious justification for financial breakthrough and success that resonates deeply with many believers seeking evidence of God's favor in their lives. However, this very focus on wealth and blessing has drawn intense criticism from a wide spectrum of Christian theologians, leaders, and laypeople. Critics argue that the prosperity gospel distorts the core message of Christianity, shifting the focus from the cross, sacrifice, and spiritual redemption to a transactional faith centered on material gain. They contend that it can exploit the vulnerable by suggesting that a lack of wealth indicates a lack of faith, and they point to the stark contrast between this theology and the teachings of Jesus on humility and the perils of wealth. For these observers, Bishop Walker's success and his message represent a problematic merger of spiritual authority and capitalist ambition, raising questions about the compatibility of his teachings with traditional Christian doctrine. 15. Fred Hammond stands as a monumental figure in gospel music, widely credited as one of the principal architects of the urban contemporary gospel sound that reshaped the genre in the 1990s and 2000s. As the founder of the group Commission and later as a massively successful solo artist, his innovative fusion of gospel lyrics with a smooth production and rhythms of R&B brought the music to a new generation. His work with the band Radical for Christ created an energetic, band-driven worship experience that was both spiritually potent and musically sophisticated. This very innovation, however, placed him at the center of a simmering debate about the boundaries of sacred music and the personal life of a gospel artist. The polarization began with his musical direction. Hammond's signature sound was unapologetically polished and accessible, designed to compete with secular R&B on its own terms. This approach reached its peak of controversy with songs like Let Me Praise You, a track whose intimate lyrics and sensual, slow jam musical arrangement struck many traditional listeners as being too romantic and sexually suggestive for a worship context. Critics argued that he was blurring a sacred line, making gospel music too sexy, and potentially confusing the feeling of romantic love with the expression of devotion to God. For these guardians of tradition, the song exemplified a dangerous shift toward a secular sound that compromised the distinct, sanctified identity of gospel music. This artistic controversy was later compounded by a deeply personal and very public scandal involving his divorce from his wife of many years and his subsequent remarriage. In a community that holds marital covenants in the highest regard, especially for those in ministry, these events sparked intense discussion and disappointment among his fan base. The personal turmoil forced him to step away from his pulpit as an elder, framing the situation as a personal failure, which added a layer of human frailty to the image of the celebrated superstar. For some, this was a private matter and a testament to God's grace and redemption. For others, it called his spiritual authority into question and created a dissonance between the man and the music.
It went something like this.
That Reverend James Cleveland earned his title as the King of Gospel through a career of unparalleled influence, shaping the very sound of modern gospel music for decades. As a pianist, composer, and arranger, he pioneered the transition from a Jubilee style to a more robust, improvisational sound rooted in the black sacred music tradition, directly influencing everyone from Aretha Franklin to the modern choir movement. His founding of the Gospel Music Workshop of America in 1968 created an essential institution that nurtured thousands of musicians and singers, ensuring the genre's vitality for generations. This towering legacy, built on a foundation of musical and spiritual authority, made the controversies that emerged late in his life all the more shocking and divisive for the community that revered him. The polarization stemmed from a severe financial crisis that publicly challenged the image of the revered maestro. Late in his life, Reverend Cleveland faced a significant lawsuit from the Internal Revenue Service for failing to pay millions of dollars in back taxes. This legal battle was compounded by accusations of financial mismanagement and impropriety within the very organization he founded, the Gospel Music Workshop of America. For an artist whose work was a bedrock of the church, these allegations struck at the heart of the trust placed in him by his peers and followers, tarnishing the golden years of his career with allegations of fiscal irresponsibility. This financial scandal created a deep and painful schism within the gospel world. For his detractors and those impacted by the GMWA's financial troubles, the situation was a clear-cut case of a leader failing in his stewardship. It was seen as a profound betrayal, a fall from grace that raised uncomfortable questions about the financial governance of religious institutions and the moral responsibilities of its most prominent figures. The fact that the king was entangled with the IRS was, for some, a source of deep embarrassment and a stain on the reputation of gospel music itself. 17.
Truth is, I'm weak.
Tamela Mann is widely cherished as one of the most beloved voices in contemporary gospel music, an artist whose powerful anthems like Take Me to the King and God Provides have resonated deeply with a vast audience, securing her numerous awards and a reputation for sincere, heartfelt ministry. Her public persona, built alongside her husband David Mann over decades, is one of a relatable, faith-filled couple who have weathered life's storms together. This very image of authenticity, however, has been the subtle source of the limited polarization that surrounds her career, stemming primarily from the commercial platforms they have chosen and the inevitable scrutiny that comes with public life. The primary point of contention for some critics lies in the couple's long and successful association with filmmaker Tyler Perry. Through his stage plays and the Medea film franchise, Tamela and David became household names, with her portraying the endearing Cora and him the scene-stealing Mr. Brown. While this work brought them immense popularity and provided a significant financial platform for their music, it also drew criticism from those who believed Perry's productions, for all their heart, often rely on broad, comedic stereotypes of black family and church life. Some viewers and cultural commentators feel that these characterizations can be reductive, leading to a tension between Mann's status as a gospel icon and her participation in works that some feel trade in caricature. This exposure was further amplified when the couple launched their own reality television show, The Manns, which offered an intimate look into their marriage, family, and business endeavors. While for many fans this was a welcome chance to connect more deeply with the couple, it also opened their personal lives and marital struggles to a new level of public judgment. The decision to monetize their relationship and broadcast its challenges, including periods of intense conflict, struck some observers as a departure from traditional notions of private ministry, creating a divide between those who saw it as inspiring transparency and those who viewed it as a potentially exploitive crossover into entertainment. 18. Bishop T.D. Jakes stands as one of the most influential and recognizable religious leaders of the modern era, building a ministry that spans a massive megachurch, best-selling books, and popular conferences. His message of empowerment and overcoming adversity has resonated with a global audience, cementing his status as a spiritual leader for millions. This very prominence, however, has placed him under intense scrutiny, with recent years bringing a wave of controversies that have challenged his long-standing reputation and introduced a complex layer of polarization to his legacy. The most serious challenges have emerged from allegations of sexual misconduct dating back to the 1980s. A man named Dwayne Youngblood publicly accused Jakes of attempted grooming and assault, claims that were later supported by an affidavit from his brother. Bishop Jakes has vehemently denied all accusations, characterizing them as patently false and filing a defamation lawsuit against his accuser. While Jakes later voluntarily dismissed this lawsuit, the legal battle and the serious nature of the allegations have cast a long shadow, forcing his congregation and the public to grapple with these claims against a figure they have long trusted. Further complicating his public image are his associations and theological positions. Jakes was mentioned in a lawsuit against music mogul Sean Diddy Combs, which led to a flurry of unverified social media rumors linking him to Combs' parties. His representatives swiftly denied these rumors as baseless. On a doctrinal level, he has faced long-standing criticism from more traditionalist Christian circles for his historical stance on the Trinity, which some critics have labeled as modalism, and for his perceived ties to the prosperity gospel movement. These factors have created a perception among some observers that his ministry has drifted toward commercialism and questionable partnerships.